This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Derrell Peel, Oklahoma State University livestock economist, begins today's show as he talks about a pause in the market and how different sectors are doing. Continuing today's show is K-State's Mike Stamm and Scoular's Ed Prosser as they explain how canola has expanded in Kansas and what research has improved the crop. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, ends the show discussing common color combinations in wildlife and how it impacts how they are preyed on. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Great to be here.
Derrell, wanting to begin our conversation with just an overall cattle market update.
Yeah, cattle markets have, they've kind of taken a little bit of a pause here lately, broadly speaking. We've seen a little bit of pullback. I think this is just the market kind of taking a breath in many cases. And obviously it depends a little bit on whether you look at the futures markets or the cash markets, but kind of across the board, I think we're just kind of, summer's over. We're sort of transitioning to fall and winter markets and markets are just kind of taking a little breather.
Are you seeing that breather when we look at boxed beef as well?
We've seen a fairly dramatic decline in boxed beef prices in the past few weeks. Now that's from, record levels. And so they're still pretty high. But I think a lot of eyes are on it because we've seen a fairly persistent decline here lately. So we're sort of looking at where will this thing stabilize. I do expect it to do that. I don't think we're talking about massive changes in demand as much as we are, I think, transitioning again from sort of summer markets with a grilling focus to fall markets. Different products kind of take the forefront here. And we're already seeing some movement towards the holiday period when we'll be pricing in a lot of things like ribeyes or rib rolls for holiday products. So I think there's just some transition going on in that market.
Do you think we're changing where we're at in the cattle market cycle right now?
I don't think anything has really changed fundamentally, not from a supply standpoint. Again, I do think we're seeing a little bit of shifting in terms of maybe some of the margin issues in the industry. Packing industry, of course, has struggled with their margins for many months now and continues to. But part of what may be happening with this boxed beef market could be the fact that as beef production has declined more dramatically in the last few weeks, or really the last few months, some of that pressure now for margins is going to shift towards the retail side. And so I think maybe some of what we're seeing here might be that combined with, again, just the seasonality, the time of year that we are. And so I think it's a matter of sort of transitioning in the market.
Have you seen more culling this fall?
Well, I don't know that you can say, seasonally, we normally see a lot more culling in the fall. It's the time of the year. We have noticed that some producers sold calves early, at least in Oklahoma and in some areas. We've seen some early selling of calves, and that could be followed by early culling kinds of things, or where we're checking these cows. But in general, we expect to see seasonally, we expect to see some increase in cow culling as we get into the fall. There again, we've seen some pressure on those cull cow prices, but pretty minimal up to this point.
Derrell, you mentioned early culling, and is that something, if producers are doing that, are going to affect them further down the road, whether individually as an operation or as a cattle market?
I think it's an interesting question because as I continue to do meetings with producers, there's still a lot of producers talking about the decision about potentially retaining heifers and, thinking about any herd expansion. And obviously the culling side, cull cow prices have been very attractive. We've culled pretty hard on these cull cows, although cow slaughter has dropped pretty dramatically. And so I think there's a lot of issues there for producers to think about in terms of cull cow values, heifer values, that trade-off, if you will, between whether or not to hang on to those cows and or go ahead and roll into some heifers. I think there's just a lot of issues that producers are thinking about right now relative to their herd status as well as their intentions going forward.
Derrell, before this also, you mentioned that you'd recently visited some feedlots, and what were you seeing when you were interacting on those operations?
Yeah, the feedlots, we were actually in several feedlots out in the Texas Panhandle recently with a group of extension folks from Florida. And they were specifically looking at sort of where do those Florida calves go when they leave Florida? They almost all leave. Where do they end up? And so they were trying to learn sort of the other end of that market. It was an interesting discussion. But in general, feedlots obviously have been, increasingly concerned with the numbers of feeder cattle. Most of these feedlots are seeing their numbers decline, and we're seeing that broadly speaking, that feedlots are going to have a hard time maintaining inventory. And so there's a lot of effort to try to find cattle. And then, of course, the cost of these feeder cattle, even with very attractive cost to gain, feed cost is cheap. We've got a record corn crop coming. That's an advantage. But the cost of the feeder cattle is a real challenge. And so I think feedlots are anticipating that they're going to see more struggles in the coming months compared to maybe what they've been able to do up to this point.
As we're thinking about this time of year and spring calving cattle herds, maybe weaning those calves, and with the weather, at least here in Kansas, a little above average, is there an unfortunate conglomeration that makes this dead calf month, as you mentioned beforehand?
The industry people often refer to October as dead calf month. We have a lot of health issues that can crop up this time of the year. Again, we're seeing new crop calves being marketed. And again, I've mentioned earlier, we've seen a lot of calves marketed early this year, and many of those calves have not been weaned. Producers wanting to be sure they got in on this very hot market. And so, we could see lots of challenges here from that standpoint with calf problems. It's hot and dry in Oklahoma as well. And so it's a time of year when we typically have those kind of issues. And so stocker producers, face a lot of challenges trying to source and deal with the potential management issues that go along with calves this time of the year.
As we're thinking about getting cattle fed, what are you seeing for wheat pastures and people thinking they're going to graze cattle on wheat?
We've had pretty good conditions up until recently, at least in Oklahoma. We had an unusually cool and wet August, which set up some early planting of wheat to get forage started. Now we've turned hot and dry since then, so we're kind of stalled out right now, but hoping to get some additional moisture, keep that wheat coming. As stocker producers look at this wheat pasture market, again, lots of challenges for all the margin operations in this market. So you look at the price of these calves, you look at the fact that feedlots on the other end are scrambling to keep their numbers up, and they're buying lighter and lighter weight cattle in many cases because that's all that's available. And so the stocker guys are kind of caught in a squeeze here in the middle. And if you just look at the price spreads between calves and feeder cattle, the margins are a bit tricky. I'll say it that way. They're not as attractive as they could be. I think stocker producers have to pencil pretty carefully what their operation is going to be like to do that. Ultimately, we may have more wheat pasture than effectively we have cattle to stock it. So we'll see how it goes forward. I think stocker producers have a lot of issues to consider and to pencil out carefully as they go forward.
Derrell, you mentioned issues, and as we're recording this on Friday, the government's still not up and running. So do you see any concern as an economist with that and reports that you commonly get?
Yeah, well, of course, we're always concerned about data. And, right now we're still getting market reports that may or may not continue, depending on how long the shutdown continues. But certainly the NASS reports that we count on, I think, are very much in jeopardy. So we would expect to be getting a cattle on feed report later this month. That's a particularly important one. The October report also contains the quarterly breakdown of steers and heifers on feed. And so that's a number we'll really be wanting to watch, assuming that we get that report. We have trade data that normally comes out here early in the month, and that may be delayed as well. So obviously it is a source of concern for any market analyst, anyone trying to follow these markets in terms of disruptions in these data.
As we look forward then in the cattle market, Derrell, for the many different segments that are in the cattle industry, what are you keeping an eye on?
We've got lots of things we're keeping an eye on right now. Part of it's what we just talked about, but in terms of the normal flow of business and the normal flow of data. But again, I think we're watching everything from demand. We've seen very strong demand, but we have seen this recent weakness in boxed beef, so we're going to continue to monitor that and see if that really indicates just seasonal stuff and so on, or whether it's a more significant change. Fall of the year, we'll be watching to see whether we follow the normal, or to what extent we follow the normal kinds of seasonality of calf prices, of cull cow prices. And then, of course, we still have all of these issues relative to the Mexican border being closed, the threats from New World screwworm. And so there's just a lot of issues right now for producers to monitor and figure out, how much that may impact their decision making individually.
And Derrell, you write about a lot of these hot topics in the cattle industry in a newsletter. And so if someone would like to check that out, how can they do that?
Yeah, we write a weekly newsletter, have for a long time. There's a couple ways to get that, but probably the easiest one would just be to send me an email, derrell.peel@okstate.edu, and tell me you'd like to get the weekly newsletter. It's called the Cow-Calf Corner. It also includes some great articles by some animal science colleagues of mine as well, and we'd be happy to share that with anybody that would find it useful.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. If you would like to get subscribed to that Cow-Calf Corner newsletter, I will put his email in today's show notes on agtoday.net and the website that has the Cow-Calf Corner newsletter. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing canola with K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm and Senior Vice President of Special Projects at Scoular, Ed Prosser. Mike, Ed, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Mike, how are things looking for canola right now?
Well, a good thing about this year and planting canola is that we have moisture to plant into, so that certainly made one of the decisions a lot easier for growers this year. Everywhere that we are putting in our research trials, we've had great moisture to plant into, and that's a nice change for Kansans, I would say, this year. So I'm excited about the opportunity for what we're doing at K-State with canola breeding and the research trials that we're putting out, and I'm optimistic about the growers that are putting in the crop as well, because having the moisture there, it sure makes planting a lot easier for them.
Have you seen the amount of canola being planted expand in these past few years?
Yes, we are actually on an upwards trajectory with canola acres, and that's a good thing. We weren't there 3 or 4 years ago, but with Scoular coming into the region now and establishing the crush facility in Goodland, that has certainly sparked interest across the state, and definitely excited about that. It's having a direct impact on acres, and we're very fortunate to have that relationship and that opportunity.
How have producers worked it into their operation?
Well, we still see a lot of canola planted after wheat, and that's, I think, what we're going to continue to see in the future. But we're starting to see acres now that are kind of moving into some different regions now in the state, more so in central and even into northwest Kansas now. And so that's going to present some different rotations that we maybe traditionally haven't planted into. So potentially some wheat sorghum fallow acres that canola will be going into. In central Kansas, where we see a lot of double crop acres, we could potentially see, soybeans being planted after canola next summer after we harvest, and then moving back into another spring crop after that soybean crop, or back into wheat. So it's presenting some new opportunities for the crop across the state.
How much more has expanded? What number did you guys kind of start at to where you are now in 2025?
Shelby, I think if you go back 10 years, I think Mike calls it canola 1.0. There was a time when there were 30 or 40 or 50,000 acres between Oklahoma and Kansas. And then as processing went away, you can get down to in 2019 or 20 and 21, I think we got down to almost 5,000 acres between the two states. We believe that we're on a trajectory to plant somewhere between 75 and 100,000 acres in Kansas and Oklahoma in 2025, 2026. The plant could use 400,000 acres, and I think there'll probably be new entrants in the market that will probably pull also out of the central and southern plains. So canola's kind of having a moment. It's a high oil content seed in a market that's valuing oil, particularly around our new renewable fuels policy. So this is a part of the reason not only that we got in with K-State, but redeveloped a plant here in Kansas is because of the belief that there is room for another cash crop on the high plains. And I guess maybe in today's market environment, not only room, but a need for another cash crop on the high plains. And the idea that the central and southern plains could participate in an oilseed boom, canola really seems to be the vehicle. And Mike's helping that happen, and K-State's helping that happen.
And we've talked about a few different positives when it comes to canola. However, canola did not escape the armyworm concern that we've seen across most of the state. And what impact have you seen for the crop?
It's certainly been a challenge, and I just want to reiterate to the listeners today, and especially if you're growing canola or plan to grow canola, just be very observant. And if you have armyworms present in your area, it may not hurt to spray ahead of planting. Even they can overcome a very tender, small canola crop very easily. They're not only just affecting canola, they can affect wheat, they can affect other crops that we grow, but you really have to be vigilant. So I strongly want to emphasize that to just be on the lookout. With wheat, one of the keys is you can delay planting a little bit. With canola, we don't necessarily have that luxury because we've kind of run out of our planting window for Kansas. That's typically September 1 to September 30. So we're past that now. Maybe it's a little bit of a blessing in disguise that we've had rain, and that's delayed planting somewhat, especially further south in the state. So we just have to be vigilant with the armyworms because we really don't have an opportunity to replant if they become an issue. So definitely keep an eye on things.
And as we hopefully have a very successful growing season for canola, and looking towards the end, Mike, you mentioned that with the new varieties and with the research, you're seeing more oil per acre. And what are some different uses for canola and it being crushed?
That's really what's been interesting. So the U.S. oil crushing industry has added about $6 billion worth of infrastructure over the course of the last 24 months. This is built around the need for vegetable oil in renewable fuels, most notably renewable diesel. And those markets were really active in 22 and 23 and into early 24. There has been some government uncertainty around certain policies over the course of the last 24 months. We seem to be getting that sorted out. A couple of the proposals that have come out of the EPA recently have demanded domestic ring fences for feedstocks. So we believe that we're still on a trajectory to take carbon out of the fuel stream and have a domestic product help us do that. We still think that the farmer has a role to play in energy policy. And as oil becomes the preferred commodity for that, oil expresses itself in the crush as a bigger part of the value. This is where canola shines because canola has twice as much oil as soybeans. Soybeans are 80% meal and 20% oil, and canola is 40% and 60% meal. So it's a much better, as oil leads the crush, it's a much better crop. And Mike's work, the industry's work around how much oil content particular seeds have is a trait that we certainly pay very much attention to because it can change the value of the crop pretty quickly. But the reason that Scoular invested in Kansas and going through, because it is a hard lift to get a new crop. But the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is really producing vegetable oil on the Great Plains. And that's really why we've been so intensely interested on what the oil content is. So, and Mike, you could maybe mention some of the research that's going on as far as the variability and some of the traits, because it is so important as we go forward. It's very much a quality trait like we would think of with protein in wheat or, the milling quality of wheat. It's just it's a kind of a new quality standard that farmers have to deal with.
And I'll just add, oil is in the seed is produced at the tail end of the grain filling period for canola. It's really kind of the last thing that's placed in the seed, so to speak. So there's a genetic component to oil. We certainly see there are certain genetic backgrounds where you see a higher oil content, but then you also have to think about what is the weather like when that grain is filling, and then are my management practices on the farm balancing this out? Am I doing what I need to do to protect the crop so that the oil content remains high? And so, we think about swathing the crop prior to harvest or direct harvesting. Well, typically, if we direct harvest a canola crop, we'll generally see a slightly higher oil content than if we swath. So we're really trying to protect that oil content, whether you're swathing or direct cutting. We need to make sure that those are timely operations and not impacting the oil content. I would say we have seen a trend towards more people direct harvesting canola in the state because they want to move away from the swathing operation. And so I think in general, that's going to benefit the crop as we move forward. And we have more varieties now that allow us to direct harvest. We have better what we call pod integrity. So those types of things, working hand in hand with our management practices, and then, factoring in the weather, that's ultimately going to affect the oil content of the crop.
Are you able to use the canola meal for anything?
With the new cheese plant in Dodge City, we're getting a lot more dairy cows. And canola meal is a great part of the dairy ration. So one of the advantages that we have in Kansas is canola meal doesn't have to go very far. We don't have to put it in a rail car and ship it overseas. It goes in a truck and goes to a dairy down the road. So the canola meal, for the most part, is within 150 miles of Goodland. We are sending some to beef feedlots, but as the dairies continue to add cattle out there, I think that that's really been our target market, and it has been robust. I mean, the milk market's been really good. So it is, it's a great way from an economic development perspective to kind of keep the money in-house in Kansas. And we're finding Goodland as a great home, and Western Kansas agriculture is a great place to do business.
Ed, Mike, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having us. It was nice.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was Senior Vice President of Special Projects at Scoular, Ed Prosser, and K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show learning about color selection in wildlife with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Shelby.
Drew, as we're thinking about color in wildlife, what are a few different scenarios or color combinations that we might think of?
Generally speaking, there, of course, are a lot of different kinds of coloration, but two of the main ones, the main categories that critters fall into are cryptic coloration, which we often think of, we would call that camouflage, or they have aposematic coloration, which a much simpler way of saying that would just be warning coloration. So typically that's going to be strong colors that contrast against each other. So if we think about a skunk and it stands out, and once we've had that bad experience, then we know to avoid it.
And how does this coloration of being whether cryptic or warning colors play into if they're a prey or going to be preyed on?
There's a new study that came out this summer in the journal Science. It was replicated across the whole globe, basically. So it's got really robust results because they put out like 15,000 artificial lepidopterans, which Lepidoptera is the family that moths and butterflies are in. So they put out these triangles of paper that had a mealworm on them. So they actually had a food reward. And the artificial moths or butterflies were either brightly colored, and some of them were your typical, let's say, a monarch butterfly type color. It's red or orange and black that alternate and stand out. Well, animals that have eaten a monarch butterfly know that they have nasty compounds inside of them that come from the milkweed plants that they feed on as caterpillars that might make me sick. And so then I avoid that color of caterpillar out there because of that warning coloration. They also put out some atypical warning coloration, which instead of the orange and black might have been blue and black. So still strong contrasting, and it stood out, but it was different from what those predators would have been used to seeing. And then they also put out some paper triangles that were brown, that would blend into the environment like that cryptic coloration. And so they were able to look to see if there was any effect of competition among predators on how this color affected whether they were eaten or not. They also looked in areas where there was low light and high light. And then they looked in areas where there were lots of other species that have warning coloration or not, and then lots of other species that had the cryptic coloration or camouflage or not. And so they looked at quite a few different variables with this, and critters with that warning coloration would be avoided, and that the camouflage color or cryptic coloration would make it harder to find. But the study found that all of these different things that they looked at sort of impacted whether or not you were more or less likely to be preyed on in those two different categories of predation. And so both are kind of good strategies from a prey standpoint.
What is most likely to be preyed on?
Really what they found is that it was context dependent. So the warning strategies were best in areas where there weren't a lot of predators. And basically what that tells us is that the more competition there is for prey, or the more it might need to snatch up prey, then the more willing it is to take a chance that it might accidentally snag something that's going to make it sick. They also found that the imitations of the warning coloration that were atypical, so the blue and black instead of orange and black, were more likely to be sampled than the ones that they're familiar with. And then they found that the camouflage strategies are really best when light levels are low, so we don't have a lot of light to make them pop out, and then also in areas where most of the prey species aren't already camouflaged. So that relates back to search images, basically. If the predators in the area are already used to looking for hard-to-find prey because cryptic coloration is common, then they're going to be more likely to find that cryptic one that we put out there or a new species than they would be otherwise.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.